The courage to grow is business. The Big Small Business Show made possible by MTN Business, a new world of business.
And by Chartered Accountants of South Africa. Lead your industry with a responsible partner. Partner with the CASA today.
On the menu today, you know, I think the tagline right now is Zimbabwe is open for business, and I experienced that recently, having gone there.
I think it's a good assumption to say that money has got a faster speed than an average human being, but there is something that we've learned is if you chase passion, money is running so fast, it's going towards passion. So all you need to do is just catch the passion, and then the money will come.
What is ZARX?
Right, ZARX is a fully fledged independent stock exchange, separate entirely from the JSE and able to take its own listings and has its own trading rules and listings regime.
Welcome to the Big Small Business Show. How can I be of service to you? And that's really what business is all about. It's about being of service to you, the client. It's about you being of service to me, about paying me for my services, and about me making sure that all the stakeholders in my business are served. This is the show for you if you're an entrepreneur or a wannabe entrepreneur. Let's go meet our first guest. Welcome to the panel discussion today, and today we're going to have a different panel discussion. We are on location, and we have on location or in studio with us Donovan Chimhandamba. He is the executive chairman of the DIDG, which stands for the Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group. And this business, as it were, this grouping is trying to drive investment back into Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is very topical right now. There's a lot of excitement. People are waiting to see what's going to be happening on the ground. And I think there's going to be huge opportunity for investors to come back into Zimbabwe, but it doesn't come without its issues. Welcome.
Thank you, Alan. It's great to be here.
Right, so let's start talking about, we started with the issues. It's very exciting now, what's happening. There's inverted commas, a regime change, and elections that are imminent, and that means big change for Zimbabwe. And the sentiment right now is that things are on the up and up, but there's also sobriety that the actual underlying economy is broken in so many places that it'll take a long time to fix that. Is that a good summary of what's going on? Well,
you're probably spot on. I think the change probably started around November. Obviously, there's a new government. There might be some individuals who were in the old government or old dispensation, but it's very clear that they're trying to reform. They have already set us on a reform path. I think it's still very early in terms of whether they'll deliver on that reform agenda that they have. But also the elections also bring in an opportunity for Zimbabwe to actually clearly state that it's now changed in terms of how it does its business, how it conducts its political issues or manages its political issues. And from where we sit, we can only see one outcome for Zimbabwe, which is that whoever wins, Zimbabwe is still on the upward trajectory.
Yeah. You know, I think the tagline right now is Zimbabwe is open for business. And I experienced that recently, having gone there and was there on a Sunday afternoon looking at some property, and the gate was closed and the security guard was there, and the person I was with leant out of the car and said, Zimbabwe is open for business. And the security guard opened the doors and allowed us to view the property. So there's a general, and wherever you go, there's a general sense that there is a desire for doing business again.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's just not only in that space. I mean, we've seen when you deal with government institutions, for example, there are certain bureaucracies that we would know that would take years before you even get clarity in terms of whether you're allowed to do or conduct or own a certain asset. So we definitely, Zimbabwe is open for business. And I mean, looking at one of the transactions we've done, I mean, we're quite amazed. Actually, we are a bit slower than the expectations of the government. And the way they're mobilizing around making it easy to do business is whenever you have a project like ours, which is deemed a project of national status or high priority.
Let's talk about that project. What is that project?
Well, we formed a joint venture with Transnet of South Africa, and effectively we bid it to take over the National Railways of Zimbabwe on a concession basis. So between us, Transnet, and the National Railways of Zimbabwe, we're forming a new concession operator, which will run the previously run NRZ for 25 years. And that alone, I mean, back in the days, NRZ was the largest employer, maybe even up to today, was the largest employer in the country and used to be the highest in terms of gross revenue turnover business for the government. But it is, I mean, over the years, like any other business in the country, it has dilapidated a little bit. So that's the project that we're working on. And our experience with the bureaucracy is that Zimbabwe is indeed open for business.
So let's just talk about the open for business, because that implies a whole bunch of international investors. And when I say international, I include South African investors as well, who are seeing this as an opportunity. But one of the big issues, and we'll talk about the different issues, and is how do you get your money repatriated back to South Africa? So it's all very well to go and invest in Zim, but how do you get your money back out? Because there's no forex in the country. Do you think that is going to change anytime soon?
I strongly believe that it's not sustainable to maintain the status regime in terms of currency. And my view is that the government is obviously holding back in terms of doing what they're supposed to do just purely because of the elections. I think what they need to do is very drastic. There's going to be some people who lose a lot of money, but it's what's needed. Now, with the elections, just...
What are you talking about? I'm just trying to understand what you mean.
No, I think we're going to have to abolish the bond note, the RTGS, all these the virtual currencies that are not backed by any asset in the country.
And go to dollar or rand?
Whichever. We can join the Rand Monetary Union, or we can dollarize like what we did in 2009. But both will bring in some stability in terms of, you can't run two parallel markets in terms of currency. One which is virtual and backed by nothing, and the other one is the hard dollar. So what you end up with is a system where bad money chases out real money. And when a country like Zimbabwe, which is not producing for self-sufficiency and relies on imports, you get to a point where you have a cash lockup in terms of foreign currency requirements. So it's not sustainable, and everyone is very clear in terms of that. I think the difference between the two parties, or the political parties in the fray, is that each one has a different way in terms of sequencing of getting that done. But everyone agrees and knows that that's not going to be the case for long after the elections. So when, in our case, when we look at the business, yes, we understand that in the current scenario, you're looking at, having some local currency earnings. But if you take NRZ, most of our revenues are driven by pit to port. And, Zimbabwe has to deliver commodities to the ports, either Durban, Richards Bay, Maputo, Beira. And the customers buying there are paying in US dollar currencies. And we are allowed in the current regime, before any changes, to have offshore accounts that receive those US dollar currencies. So even in our structure, we've structured instruments that allow offshore redemption or settlement of any foreign currency debt that has been lent to us to invest in the railway company.
We've got very little time before we have to go to a break now, but I want to start the conversation about Zimbabwean human capital, because the one positive thing, and I'm trying to move between the negative and the positive here, is that the view is that the education system withstood all the decline in the economy, and therefore there is huge intellectual capital still available in Zim.
That's for sure. I think the sad part, there's a good and a bad part. I think under the Mugabe dispensation, there was a lot of focus on education. I think we have, in the world, or probably at least in Africa, some of the highest literacy rates. Everyone went to school. I went to school literally for free. My university, I got an honors in engineering degree, and I paid 60 rands at the end to get my certificate. That kind of, education was not discriminative based on how much as a family or what you have, but it was based on your capability intellectually to go into any school facility. So we created a lot of people with these brains, but then at the same time, our economic policies didn't allow the growth in the industry to absorb these brains. So you'll find that over time, there's been a depletion of the quality skills into the diaspora, because when you can't find anything reasonable to do, you naturally then migrate into other economies or geographies to find something where you can best serve or use your brains and obviously make a living.
We're going to have to take a break now, and that's a good segue. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the diaspora and their role in building a new Zimbabwe. We continue the conversation around Zimbabwe and its rebirth, Zimbabwe being open for business, with Donovan Chimhandamba, who is the executive chairman of DIDG, which is the Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group. And previously, before the break, we were talking about some of the issues within Zimbabwe and of course, some of the positive elements, which is the intellectual capital, the fact that the education system remained quite buoyant throughout the last 37 years. In fact, it has produced some of the best people, or best educated people on the African continent, arguably. But some of those people have left. And the big sentiment that I felt when I was there was that there were two waves of diaspora. There were those that have already started to come back and starting to re-establish themselves. And then there's going to be the second wave of diaspora coming back that might be a bit too late because all the opportunities have been taken.
That's a spot-on analysis. So we started DIDG in 2016, and at that time it was still under the President Mugabe's regime. And when we coalesced, we say to ourselves, we are Zimbabweans living in South Africa, and we've got mates around the world, and what are we going to do about Zimbabwe? Are we going to take a position? We don't believe the status quo will remain the same forever. Everyone has got a finite time in terms of living. So we said, at what point do we put a marker and say, when do we go back? Now, we took a bold decision at that point, and we were 10 of us when we started. Today, we're sitting with a membership of 2,300, just over 2,300 diasporans, spread across the world with about 50% of them in South Africa. But our agenda was very simple. We said, if we're going back into Zimbabwe, when is the perfect time? And our answer was very simple. Number one was to go in when there's less competition. As a Zimbabwean, I don't believe after elections you'll be able to take some of these big parastatals or big positions, whether in mining or FMCG or whatever it is, because you'll start competing with multilaterals and multinationals with deep pockets. So there are those diasporans who continue to look at an election as the moment, and yet we were seeing the moment as a phased period where gradually you're going to see the old dispensation fade away and gradually you see a new dispensation coming in. It just happened when we were already in and we didn't realize. But yes, that's the issue, and you're going to get those diasporans who come in a bit late. And unfortunately, they're going to have to compete with the multilaterals from US, UK. We've already seen that. So that's the sad situation for Zimbabweans in diaspora, but a good thing for the Zimbabwean country, because that means a lot of capital is coming in.
But let's come back to some of the other issues, which is unemployment. And I don't know if it's an official statistic, but certainly the street statistic there's a 90% unemployment. So how do you begin to fix that? How do you begin to fix a country with 90% of the population are unemployed? Let's call it officially unemployed, because around every street corner there are there's a vendor, there's an inverted commas an entrepreneur. What are the first steps to fixing that?
I think a lot of it has to do with opening up the industries, letting private sector come in and invest their capital. I think the government has realized, and so as the opposition has always said, that government cannot lead the revitalization or regeneration of work. What it can only do is to facilitate and make the environment possible. But definitely opening up the economy, the realization of being sober that you're not going to be able to regenerate the industry alone. You're going to need foreign direct investment. And by that, it means you have to reform your policies to allow for the foreign investors to do that. The other thing that many people don't actually realize, and I think, in fact, this policy started under Robert Mugabe, but it's more pronounced now with the new dispensation. I'll give you some numbers which are quite startling. 2016, FDI was about $315 million. This is the money that states will go on parades and say we've been to China or wherever. We've brought back, it was paltry $315 million. The next biggest ticket item in 2016 on the
mostly from China?
Mostly from China. China is the only lender when your country is deemed uninvestable. So the second biggest item was $760 million, but not in hard currency, in things like food aid and packages from donor agencies and NGOs. And the biggest investment in the country was $4 billion from diaspora through remittances from people like myself, where we send $1,000 to support school fees and our families that are still in Zimbabwe. And the government realized that if we're sitting with an economy that has a government or public expenditure of $5 billion, and $4 billion of money into Zimbabwe is coming from diaspora, maybe we need to revise our policies and attract the diasporans. So what they've done, they've put certain incentives around the diasporans that when you come back, you will get tax holidays in your investment, in certain strategic investment, 5-year tax holiday, flat income tax of 15% instead of 28%, import duties slashed off to zero, bringing back your cars, whatever cars or equipment that you try and bring. Repatriation of your dividends, it's the zero tax. Those are the things that are starting to speak to the diasporans and allowing us to have dual citizenship. You don't necessarily we don't live in the countries that we put all our money in. We have money in Rwanda, we have money in Ghana, but we don't necessarily have to live there. So if I think there is a realization around that, and maybe the elections are a little bit distracting people from some of these issues, but I'm confident that after the elections, we're going to see a steady ship starting to come out of Zimbabwe.
We're going to have to take a break now. When we come back, we will continue with our third and final part in our discussion around Zimbabwe open for business. We are now concluding our third part in our discussion with Donovan Chimhandamba, who is Executive Chairman of DIDG, which is the Diaspora Infrastructure Development Group, focusing particularly in Zimbabwe. Now, before the break, we were talking about the diaspora. Okay, let's talk about the title deeds, property rights, etc., security, general security. Because the sense that I get when I'm in Zimbabwe is that the security issue, as in physical security, is very good. There isn't a sense of anarchy. There's a sense of order and law and order, particularly in Harare, in the bigger cities. But we can't have a discussion around them without talking about property rights.
For sure, for sure. I think when we talk about security, you're spot on in the sense that there's two forms people look at. Crime, in terms of violent crime, Zimbabwe doesn't have any of that. In fact, you can walk through the streets at night quite safely. Not everyone, your chances of meeting people carrying guns is very little. So in terms of physical security, Zimbabwe is probably one of the safest places to live in. When it comes to property rights, I think what has happened, or what had happened in the previous regime, as they tried to enforce, their land status positions, that was carried out probably in other quarters. What they would say is anarchy. It wasn't, It was being done by the ruling people's people who went on a massive, some through the proper processes, but the majority through basically land grabs. Now, that left a lot of the agricultural sector in a quagmire because they had banged on the basis of land being the security. The farmers were collateralizing the land. Now, when the country cannot give property rights or certainty around property rights, whatever you do just falls apart because the bank's natural security that they deem as security is land. Mm-hmm. So property rights are very essential. So now what we have seen now with the new regime, and unfortunately it's only probably 4 months, 5 months with the new dispensation, but there's definitely a commitment to honor property rights. We are seeing certain situations where certain illegal land grabs that had happened or property invasions that had happened being reversed. So I think we are on a trajectory, and I think it's one of those reform things where the policy might be correct, but the enforcement needs to tighten up to make sure that there's property rights for the investors.
Let's just finish off now. We've got a few more minutes talking about your plans to, we've spoken about the railway opportunity, but there must be other opportunities that you are looking at in Zim. And anyone who's thinking about coming into Zim and perhaps wanting to participate with you, what kind of opportunities are you looking at?
Okay, no, thanks for that. I think let me start by explaining what we are and what we intend to be. And then from there, you can actually understand the corporate action that we're doing in Zimbabwe. So we're trying to achieve 2 things. The first one, we realize that diaspora sits with a lot of cash. Mm-hmm. So imagine there's 4 to 5 million Zimbabweans, first generation in diaspora. I don't know about the second generation in diaspora. And if we could get, for example, 1 million of those diasporans each put in $100 or $1,000, that's $1 billion annually. Mm. Israel, since 1951, has been doing bond issuances for diaspora. It's raised close to $31 billion. India has done that 3 times. They did 3 issues, 98, 2001, 2003. Ethiopia, first one failed because they didn't trust the government. The second one worked. So our first agenda is to provide a platform that allows for the aggregation of diaspora small investments, mm-hmm. which we have done. We are busy with our collective investment schemes, which we will list in Mauritius and inwardly in Zimbabwe or in South Africa, just to give access to the larger diaspora. The second thing that the diaspora actually brings is the skills. They have more skills than the money. So through NRZ as an example, we've realized there are a lot of guys who are in senior positions in Network Rail, formerly British Rail, Japan, and etc. They're all Zimbabweans. We already created a platform called the Diaspora Consult business, which basically aggregates various skills in order to provide a turnkey solution to our projects or any other projects that are not ours. Now, how we do that, we see ourselves as, maybe this is not the best example considering what's happening in South Africa around construction industry, but we see ourselves as a diversified engineering, construction, manufacturing company that within the infrastructure space. So we go around taking the commanding height of a sector. In rail, no doubt it's NRZ. Airports, no doubt you have to deal with the civil aviation of Zimbabwe. Water, you have to deal with Zino. And once we take control of that, then we can dictate or at least control the supply of diaspora resources, be it financial or technical, into that. So that's what we're seeing. So we are starting to move, firstly, within the value chain of NRZ. We've already done a couple of acquisitions, which will be announced at the proper time. We're moving into the airports management and infrastructure space. We've signed a couple of MOUs there, and we're looking at some water infrastructure. But again, we're focused on managing and controlling formerly controlled or managed parastatals within that economic infrastructure space. So that's the space you will find us. And any acquisitions or corporate action we do within this value chain is informed by our idea or belief that we can then ensure that the entire supply chain is efficient and produces an infrastructure delivery service at a very cost-effective price.
Sure. I just want to say that I think what you are trying to do and what you are doing is very important, not just for Zimbabwe, but for the whole African continent. And I wish you really a lot of luck, and I know it's going to be a difficult journey ahead, But I think it's an important journey to go on, and it's very exciting. I think that's the right word, very exciting to see such focused attention on revitalizing Zimbabwe. It's an important thing that needs to be done. And Donovan, thank you for being on the show and for sharing your insights into Zim. It's positives and its negatives, so that we can all make a decision for ourselves.
No, thank you very much.
Up next.
Just because you lacked it, it's not a thing that you actually lacked. I mean, I know I come from lack, so I didn't actually lack a Louis Vuitton bag. I lacked a feeling.